Welcome, Sentinel of the Night, to a journey through the twisted corridors of fear itself, where childhood trauma blooms into psychological terror and the study of human emotion becomes a weapon against the very souls it was meant to heal. Tonight, we shall explore the complete chronicles of Jonathan Crane, the man who transformed from professor to predator, from scholar to scarecrow, whose understanding of fear's deepest mysteries would make him one of Gotham's most haunting adversaries. Close your eyes, guardian of dreams, and let these tales of broken minds and shattered innocence carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace the dark metamorphosis of academia's most dangerous son. In the rolling hills of rural Georgia, where Spanish moss draped ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and the air hung thick with the weight of secrets too dark for daylight confession, there came into this world a child whose very birth was marked by abandonment and shame. The year was 1967, and in the modest town of Arlen, a teenage girl named Karen Keeney found herself facing the consequences of choices that her strict religious upbringing had taught her were unforgivable sins against both God and family honor. Karen was barely 17 when she discovered that her brief romance with Gerald Crane, a drifter who had passed through town like a storm, had left her with more than just broken promises and whispered regrets. The pregnancy that followed was a source of such shame to the Keeney family that it threatened to destroy the carefully constructed facade of respectability they had maintained for generations in their small community. In an era when unwed motherhood carried a stigma that could ruin entire bloodlines, the Keeneys faced a crisis that demanded desperate measures and cruel solutions. The matriarch of this troubled family was Mary Keeney, Karen's grandmother, a woman whose religious fervor burned with the intensity of medieval fanaticism and whose understanding of Christian compassion had been warped by decades of rigid adherence to the most punitive interpretations of Scripture. Mary had built her entire identity around being the moral authority of her community, the woman to whom neighbors turned for guidance in matters of sin and redemption, and the prospect of her own granddaughter bearing a bastard child threatened everything she had worked to achieve. When Karen's condition could no longer be hidden beneath loose clothing and careful positioning, Mary made the decision that would shape the destiny of the child who had not yet drawn his first breath. The infant would be taken from his mother immediately upon birth, raised by Mary herself, according to proper Christian principles, while Karen would be sent away to live with distant relatives until the scandal had faded from community memory. The child's father, Gerald Crane, had long since disappeared into whatever shadows had spawned him, leaving behind only his surname and the genetic legacy that would prove far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. The birth itself took place in the sterile privacy of the Keeney family home, attended only by a disgraced doctor who owed Mary certain favors and a midwife whose silence had been purchased with both money and threats. The infant who emerged into this world of conditional love and predetermined shame was small and pale, with dark hair that would later grow lank and lifeless, and eyes that seemed already to hold depths of understanding inappropriate for someone who had existed for mere minutes. Karen was permitted to hold her son only once, a brief moment of maternal connection that Mary viewed as necessary for the child's initial bonding, but dangerous if allowed to continue. In that single embrace, the teenage mother whispered promises she would never be allowed to keep. Apologies for abandoning him to circumstances beyond her control, and a name that would be erased before the sun set on his first day of life. Mary had already chosen what the child would be called, a biblical designation that reflected her hopes for his spiritual development and her determination to mold him according to her own rigid interpretation of divine will. Jonathan Crane, as he would be known from that day forward, began his existence in the cramped and oppressive atmosphere of the Keeney farmhouse, a structure that had stood for 3 generations as a monument to the family's commitment to hard work, moral rectitude, and the kind of Christianity that emphasized punishment over mercy. The house itself seemed to embody the psychological atmosphere in which the child would develop, with its narrow windows that admitted little light, heavy wooden furniture that dominated every room, and walls lined with religious imagery that depicted more suffering than salvation. Mary Keeney approached the task of raising her great-grandson with the same methodical intensity that she brought to all her endeavors, viewing the infant not as a source of joy or wonder, but as a project to be completed according to specifications that would ensure his moral development proceeded along approved paths. Her understanding of child-rearing had been shaped by biblical injunctions about sparing the rod and spoiling the child, combined with folk wisdom that emphasized the importance of breaking a young person's will before it could develop into the kind of rebellious independence that had led to Karen's disgrace. The daily routine that governed Jonathan's early years was structured around work, prayer, and the constant reinforcement of his position in the household hierarchy, which placed him somewhere between the livestock and the furniture in terms of his right to consideration or comfort. He was awakened before dawn to perform age-appropriate chores that gradually expanded in scope and difficulty as he grew larger and stronger, tasks that were designed not only to contribute to the household's functioning, but to instill in him the understanding that his value was directly proportional to his usefulness. The educational component of Jonathan's upbringing was limited to biblical instruction and the basic literacy skills necessary for reading scripture, supplemented by harsh lessons in the consequences of questioning authority, or displaying the kind of intellectual curiosity that Mary associated with dangerous pride. Books other than the Bible were viewed with suspicion in the Keeney household, and any expression of interest in learning beyond the narrow confines of approved religious texts was met with swift correction that combined physical punishment with extended lectures about the dangers of worldly knowledge. The isolation that characterized Jonathan's childhood was both geographical and emotional, as the Keeney farm sat miles from the nearest neighbors, and Mary's paranoid religiosity made her suspicious of outside influences that might corrupt her great-grandson's moral development. The boy had virtually no contact with children his own age, no exposure to normal social interactions, and no opportunity to develop the kind of healthy relationships that might have provided alternative models for understanding human nature and emotional expression. The physical environment in which Jonathan spent his formative years was as oppressive as the emotional atmosphere, with the farmhouse itself serving as both home and prison, shelter and torture chamber. The building's design reflected Mary's belief that comfort was synonymous with sin, that any accommodation to human weakness or preference for ease over hardship represented a dangerous slide toward moral corruption. The rooms were kept deliberately cold in winter and stifling in summer. The furniture was chosen for durability rather than comfort, and decorative elements were limited to religious artifacts that emphasized divine wrath rather than divine love. Most significant among the house's architectural features was the family chapel, a small room that Mary had converted from a former storage space into what she considered a proper venue for private worship and moral instruction. The chapel was sparsely furnished with hard wooden benches, a simple altar topped with a crucifix that emphasized Christ's suffering rather than his resurrection, and walls lined with imagery that depicted the punishments awaiting those who strayed from righteous paths. Connected to the chapel was a small aviary that Mary maintained as part of her ongoing studies into what she termed the natural order of creation. The aviary represented Mary's attempt to find divine guidance through the observation of God's creatures, particularly those species that she believed held special significance in biblical tradition. Her collection included various songbirds that she claimed represented the souls of the righteous, predatory birds that symbolize divine judgment, and most prominently, a large population of crows that she had gathered through methods that combined scientific observation with superstitious ritual. The crows held particular fascination for Mary because of their intelligence, their black coloration that she associated with sin and redemption, and their scavenging behavior that reminded her of humanity's fallen nature. The relationship between Mary and her corvid collection was complex and disturbing, reflecting her belief that she could discern divine will through careful observation of their behavior, while also maintaining control over them through techniques that she had developed through years of experimentation. Her methods combined legitimate understanding of bird psychology and conditioning with folk magic and religious ritual that created a hybrid approach to animal control that was both effective and deeply unsettling. The young Jonathan observed his great-grandmother's interactions with her birds from an early age, noting the way she could summon them with specific calls, direct their movements through subtle gestures, and even provoke them to aggressive behavior when circumstances required demonstration of her authority. These observations planted seeds of understanding about the relationship between fear and control that would later bloom into the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that would define his adult career. The first clear indication of Jonathan's unusual intellectual development came through his response to Mary's attempts to limit his access to reading material beyond approved religious texts. Despite her vigilance and the severe punishments that awaited discovery, the boy began to seek out and consume whatever books he could find, developing reading skills that far exceeded what his formal education should have provided, and demonstrating the kind of analytical thinking that his great-grandmother viewed as evidence of dangerous pride. The works that particularly captured Jonathan's attention were those that dealt with human psychology and the nature of fear, subjects that resonated with his daily experiences under Mary's oppressive supervision, while also providing intellectual frameworks for understanding the dynamics he observed in her interactions with both human beings and animals. His reading was necessarily covert, conducted during brief moments when Mary's attention was focused elsewhere, yet his retention and comprehension of complex material suggested cognitive abilities that would have flourished under different circumstances. The discovery of Jonathan's unauthorized reading created a crisis that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his psychological development, forcing Mary to escalate her methods of control, while simultaneously revealing to the boy the full extent of her capacity for cruelty. The confrontation that followed this discovery would serve as the catalyst for transformations in both their characters that would ultimately lead to tragedy for the entire household. The specific incident that triggered this escalation involved Jonathan's possession of literature by James Joyce, an author whose Catholic background and subsequent rejection of church authority made him particularly offensive to Mary's sensibilities. The discovery of Joyce's works among Jonathan's hidden reading materials represented, in her mind, not merely disobedience, but actual blasphemy that threatened the spiritual welfare of everyone under her roof. Her response would demonstrate the lengths to which religious fanaticism could drive an otherwise intelligent woman, when combined with the absolute power she wielded over a defenseless child. The punishment that Mary devised for this transgression went far beyond simple physical correction to encompass psychological torture designed to create lasting trauma that would serve as a permanent deterrent to future intellectual rebellion. Her choice of the family chapel as the venue for this correction was deliberate, intended to reinforce the religious significance of Jonathan's offense while also providing access to the aviary that would play a crucial role in the lesson she intended to teach. The hours that Jonathan spent locked alone in the chapel, surrounded by religious imagery that emphasized divine punishment, while listening to the ominous sounds emanating from the adjacent aviary, provided him with extended time to contemplate both his transgression and the nature of the authority that governed his existence. Yet, rather than producing the penitence and submission that Mary had intended, this enforced isolation created opportunities for the kind of analytical thinking that would prove to be the foundation of his future psychological insights. The attack that followed, when Mary released her trained crows into the chapel space where Jonathan cowered in terror, represented the culmination of years of preparation and experimentation on her part, a demonstration of power that was intended to break his spirit completely while establishing her absolute authority over every aspect of his existence. The experience of being overwhelmed by a coordinated assault from creatures that seemed to respond to her will rather than natural instinct provided Jonathan with first-hand understanding of how fear could be manufactured, directed, and employed as a tool of control. Yet the most significant aspect of this traumatic experience was not the physical pain or emotional terror that Jonathan endured, but rather his intellectual response to the methodology that Mary had employed in orchestrating the attack. Even as he suffered under the assault of beak and claw, his analytical mind was processing the techniques she had used to achieve such precise control over supposedly wild creatures, filing away insights that would later be refined and perfected in his own experiments with fear manipulation. The aftermath of this punishment saw Jonathan retreat into a psychological state that combined outward compliance with inner rebellion, developing the kind of compartmentalized thinking that allowed him to appear submissive while secretly planning responses that would eventually reverse the power dynamic between himself and his tormentor. The understanding of fear that he had gained through direct experience would be supplemented by careful observation of Mary's methods, creating a comprehensive education in psychological manipulation that no formal institution could have provided. The transformation that began in those dark hours within the chapel would continue throughout the remainder of Jonathan's childhood, as he developed from victim to student to eventual practitioner of the very techniques that had been used against him, learning not only how to endure fear, but how to create and deploy it as a weapon against those who had once held power over his vulnerable existence. In the suffocating atmosphere of the Keeney farmhouse, where shadows seemed to harbor malevolent intentions and every creaking board whispered of divine displeasure, young Jonathan Crane began to understand that survival required more than simple obedience to his great-grandmother's tyrannical rule. The chapel incident had served as a brutal education in the mechanics of fear, yet it had also revealed something far more valuable: the recognition that Mary's power over him was not absolute, but rather dependent upon his continued ignorance of the methods she employed to maintain her psychological dominance over every aspect of his existence. The weeks that followed his ordeal with the crows were marked by a careful performance of submission that concealed the revolutionary changes taking place within his developing consciousness. Jonathan learned to present the appearance of broken spirit and renewed dedication to religious obedience while secretly analyzing every aspect of Mary's behavior, cataloging her techniques, and beginning to understand the sophisticated manipulation that lay beneath her facade of righteous authority. The child who had once cowered in genuine terror was gradually replaced by a calculating observer who viewed each punishment and intimidation as an opportunity to gather intelligence about the enemy who had shaped his existence. Mary Keeney's religious fanaticism had always been extreme by the standards of her rural Georgia community, yet the chapel incident seemed to unleash even darker aspects of her personality that had previously remained hidden beneath layers of biblical justification and community respectability. Her interpretation of Scripture became increasingly focused on themes of divine wrath and punishment, while her treatment of Jonathan escalated to levels of cruelty that would have horrified even the most conservative religious authorities of her era. She began to view the boy not merely as a wayward soul in need of correction, but as a vessel of sin whose very existence represented an ongoing challenge to God's will that required constant vigilance and increasingly severe intervention. The daily routine that governed Jonathan's life under Mary's supervision became a systematic program of psychological torture designed to eliminate every trace of independent thought or will that might threaten her absolute authority. His waking hours were structured around endless cycles of physical labor, religious instruction, and punishment for infractions both real and imagined, while his sleeping hours were frequently interrupted by arbitrary demands for additional prayer or confession of sins that existed only in Mary's increasingly paranoid imagination. The isolation that had always characterized his existence became even more complete as Mary's suspicion of outside influences led her to eliminate even the minimal contact with neighbors and community members that had previously provided brief respites from the oppressive atmosphere of the play's household. The physical abuse that Jonathan endured during this period was severe enough to leave lasting scars, both visible and hidden. Yet it was the psychological torment that would prove most significant in shaping the man he would eventually become. Mary's techniques went far beyond simple beatings to encompass elaborate rituals of humiliation and terror that were designed to break down his sense of self while reinforcing her position as the ultimate arbiter of his worth and very right to exist. She forced him to confess to sins he had never committed, to beg forgiveness for thoughts she claimed to discern through divine inspiration, and to participate in his own degradation through ceremonies that combined religious ritual with sadistic creativity. The basement of the farmhouse became Mary's primary venue for these extended sessions of correction and instruction, a space that she had converted into what she termed a place of purification, where Jonathan could be cleansed of the inherited corruption that she believed flowed through his bloodline from both his absent father and his disgraced mother. The basement's natural dampness and isolation made it ideal for her purposes, while its position beneath the chapel created symbolic significance that she found deeply satisfying. Here, surrounded by religious artifacts that emphasized suffering and redemption, Jonathan learned lessons about pain and power that no theological seminary could have provided. The methods that Mary employed during these basement sessions revealed the extent to which her religious beliefs had been corrupted by sadistic impulses that found expression through elaborate justifications drawn from the darker passages of Scripture. She developed techniques that combined physical restraint with sensory deprivation, forcing Jonathan to endure hours of immobility, while she delivered sermons about his inherent wickedness and the necessity of breaking his will before it could lead him down the same path of sin that had claimed his mother. The darkness of the basement, broken only by flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows on the walls, created an atmosphere of gothic horror that would haunt Jonathan's dreams and inform his later understanding of how environment could be manipulated to enhance psychological impact. Yet even as he suffered under these escalating torments, Jonathan's analytical mind continued to function, processing and categorizing every aspect of Mary's methodology, while developing theoretical frameworks that would later be refined through formal study of psychology and fear response. He began to understand that her power over him depended not merely on her physical advantages or her control over his basic needs, but on her ability to create and maintain states of uncertainty and anticipation that made even periods of relative calm feel threatening and unstable. This insight into the relationship between predictability and psychological control would become foundational to his later work in fear manipulation and psychological warfare. The turning point in their relationship came through Jonathan's discovery of the full extent of Mary's experiments with her collection of crows, observations that revealed the scientific precision underlying what she had always presented as divinely inspired authority over God's creatures. His careful surveillance of her activities in the aviary revealed techniques that combined legitimate understanding of animal psychology with chemical manipulation and conditioning methods that represented genuine innovation in the field of behavioral control. The realization that her seemingly miraculous command over the birds was actually the result of systematic experimentation rather than supernatural power marked the beginning of his understanding that all forms of authority, no matter how impressively presented, were ultimately reducible to comprehensible techniques that could be learned, replicated, and eventually turned against their original practitioners. The chemical preparations that Mary used to control her crows involved complex combinations of pheromones, blood scents, and herbal extracts that she had developed through years of trial and error, documenting her results in journals that she kept hidden in a locked cabinet in her bedroom. Jonathan's access to these materials required careful planning and considerable risk, as discovery would have resulted in punishments that might well have proven fatal. Yet his hunger for understanding overcame his fear of consequences. The knowledge he gained from studying Mary's notes provided him with his first formal education in the manipulation of biological systems through chemical intervention, lessons that would later be expanded and refined through legitimate academic study, but which found their initial expression in crude but effective experiments conducted in secret. The laboratory that Jonathan established in an abandoned section of the farmhouse's root cellar represented his first attempt to apply the theoretical knowledge he had gained from Mary's journals to independent research and by experimentation. Working with materials scavenged from the household and surrounding farm, he began to develop his own understanding of how fear responses could be triggered and manipulated through various stimuli, starting with simple experiments on insects and small animals, before gradually expanding his scope to include more complex subjects. The isolation and secrecy required for these activities taught him valuable lessons about operational security and the importance of maintaining multiple layers of deception to protect sensitive research from discovery by hostile authorities. The subjects of Jonathan's early experiments were drawn primarily from the household's population of mice, rats, and other small creatures that Mary considered pests worthy of elimination, though his methods of disposal were far more elaborate and scientifically valuable than simple poisoning or trapping. He developed techniques for inducing specific fear responses through combinations of environmental manipulation, chemical stimulation, and conditioning protocols that allowed him to study the relationship between various stimuli and measurable changes in behavior and physiology. These crude but systematic investigations provided him with practical experience in experimental design and data collection that would serve him well in his later academic career. The most significant breakthrough in Jonathan's early research came through his successful synthesis of a primitive fear-inducing compound that combined elements from Mary's crow control preparations with additional ingredients that he had identified through careful study of his subjects' responses to various chemical stimuli. This early version of what would eventually become his signature fear toxin was crude and unpredictable, yet it represented a genuine advance in the field of psychoactive chemistry and provided proof of concept for the more sophisticated formulations he would develop in years to come. The successful creation of a substance that could reliably trigger fear responses in test subjects marked his transition from passive victim to active researcher, though the full implications of this development would not become apparent until much later. The application of his newfound knowledge to human subjects began with careful observation of Mary's own psychological vulnerabilities, weaknesses that she had inadvertently revealed through her increasingly erratic behavior and paranoid fixations. Jonathan noted that her confidence in her divine mission was actually quite fragile, dependent upon constant reinforcement through the submission of those under her authority, and vulnerable to challenges that questioned the supernatural basis of her power. Her fear of losing control over him was so intense that it compromised her judgment and made her susceptible to manipulation by anyone clever enough to exploit her psychological blind spots. The campaign of subtle psychological warfare that Jonathan began to wage against his great-grandmother was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized all his research activities, starting with minor incidents, designed to create uncertainty, and escalating gradually to more direct challenges to her authority and self-image. He began to move objects in her private spaces, leaving them in positions that suggested supernatural intervention while maintaining plausible deniability about his own involvement. He introduced foreign sounds and smells into her environment at unpredictable intervals, creating an atmosphere of unease that made her question her own perceptions and control over her domain. The crowning achievement of Jonathan's campaign against Mary was his successful reversal of her own methods, turning her beloved crows against her through careful application of the chemical compounds he had developed in his hidden laboratory. The night of her death was planned with the same attention to detail that she had brought to his own torment. Yet his approach was far more sophisticated and devastating than her crude applications of physical and psychological abuse. Using her own pheromone preparations against her, Jonathan created conditions that transformed her controlled corvid subjects into a frenzied mob that viewed her not as their master, but as prey to be eliminated through coordinated assault. The irony of Mary's destruction was not lost on Jonathan as he watched from concealment while the creatures she had trained to terrorize others turned their violence against their former mistress. Yet his response to her death was characterized more by scientific satisfaction than emotional release. The successful completion of his revenge demonstrated the validity of his theoretical approaches, while also eliminating the primary obstacle to his continued development as both scholar and predator. Her death represented not merely the end of his childhood torment, but the beginning of his adult career as a student of fear and its applications to the control and manipulation of human behavior. The disposal of Mary's remains required careful planning to avoid detection by authorities who might investigate her disappearance. Yet Jonathan's solution was elegantly simple in its use of her own methods against her posthumous reputation. He arranged the scene to suggest that her death had resulted from an accident involving her crow experiments, a conclusion that the local authorities found entirely plausible given her well-known eccentricity and the physical evidence of bird attacks on her body. The official determination that Mary Keeney had died from injuries sustained during a mishap with her aviary collection provided Jonathan with legal protection, while also serving as a satisfying conclusion to their long-running psychological duel. The freedom that Jonathan experienced following Mary's death was both liberation and opportunity, as he found himself in control of the farmhouse property, while also possessing knowledge and skills that set him apart from his rural contemporaries. The years of abuse and experimentation had shaped him into something unprecedented, a young man whose understanding of fear and psychological manipulation exceeded that of trained professionals, yet whose emotional development had been so thoroughly corrupted that he was incapable of forming normal human relationships or finding satisfaction through conventional achievements. He had become, in essence, a perfect predator disguised as a survivor, someone whose traumatic experiences had not broken him, but rather forged him into an instrument of calculated revenge against a world that had failed to protect him from the monster who had shaped his earliest years. The legacy of Mary Keeney's cruelty would continue to influence Jonathan's development long after her death, not as trauma that limited his potential, but as education that provided him with unique insights into the darkest aspects of human psychology and the most effective methods for exploiting the fears that governed most people's behavior. Her unwitting gift to him was not merely survival but expertise, a comprehensive understanding of how terror could be manufactured, refined, and deployed as the ultimate weapon against those who mistakenly believed themselves to be safe from the consequences of their own psychological vulnerabilities. The years that followed Mary Keeney's death brought Jonathan Crane into contact with a world far removed from the suffocating religious extremism and rural isolation that had defined his earliest existence. Yet the sophisticated academic environment he would eventually inhabit proved no less fertile ground for the cultivation of his unique understanding of human psychology and the mechanisms through which fear could be transformed into a tool of power and control. The transition from traumatized child to respected scholar was neither immediate nor straightforward, requiring careful navigation of social and institutional structures that had been designed to identify and exclude individuals whose psychological development deviated too dramatically from accepted norms. The discovery of Mary's extensive library, hidden in the farmhouse basement alongside her experimental journals and chemical preparations, provided Jonathan with access to educational materials that far exceeded what the local school system could offer, and revealed the extent to which his great-grandmother's intellectual capabilities had been channeled into pursuits that combined legitimate scientific inquiry with deeply disturbed applications of psychological manipulation. Her collection included advanced texts on animal behavior, religious philosophy, and primitive psychological theory that had been acquired through decades of correspondence with like-minded individuals who shared her interests in the darker applications of academic knowledge. The financial resources that Jonathan inherited through Mary's death were modest but sufficient to support his continued education and eventual escape from the Georgia countryside that held too many traumatic memories and too few opportunities for someone with his particular combination of intellectual gifts and psychological damage. The sale of the farmhouse and its surrounding land provided him with enough capital to pursue higher education, while also maintaining the independence necessary to continue his private research into fear, manipulation, and chemical experimentation without the oversight that might have revealed the true nature of his interests. The state university that Jonathan selected for his undergraduate studies was chosen not for its prestigious reputation or social advantages, but rather for its combination of academic rigor and institutional indifference that would allow him to pursue his interests without attracting unwanted attention from faculty members who might question the direction of his research or the facets intensity of his focus on subjects related to fear and psychological control. The psychology department, in particular, offered resources and opportunities that promised to provide formal training in areas where his self-education had been necessarily limited by lack of access to sophisticated laboratory equipment and human subjects. The persona that Jonathan developed during his university years was carefully crafted to present the appearance of scholarly dedication and intellectual curiosity, while concealing the darker motivations that drove his academic pursuits. The disturbing nature of the experiments he continued to conduct in private. He cultivated an image of the serious graduate student whose commitment to research bordered on obsession, a characterization that his professors found admirable rather than concerning, and that provided excellent cover for activities that might otherwise have raised questions about his psychological stability and professional suitability. The coursework that Jonathan encountered during his undergraduate years provided him with theoretical frameworks for understanding concepts that he had previously grasped only through practical experience and intuitive analysis, while also introducing him to experimental methodologies that promised to make his research far more sophisticated and effective than the crude investigations he had conducted in Mary's basement laboratory. His professors noted his exceptional analytical abilities and his remarkable intuitive understanding of psychological principles though they attributed his insights to natural talent rather than the extensive practical education in fear manipulation that had shaped his childhood development. The specific area of psychological study that captured Jonathan's primary attention was the emerging field of phobia research, an academic discipline that promised to provide scientific legitimacy for investigations into the very mechanisms that he had been exploring through his private experiments for years. The formal study of irrational fears and anxiety disorders offered both intellectual stimulation and practical applications that aligned perfectly with his long-term goals, while also providing access to research subjects who volunteered to participate in studies designed to understand and treat the very conditions that Jonathan hoped to learn to induce and manipulate. The graduate program that Jonathan entered following his successful completion of undergraduate studies was among the most competitive in the nation, attracting students whose academic credentials and research potential marked them as future leaders in their respective fields of specialization. His acceptance into this program represented both validation of his intellectual capabilities and access to resources that would prove crucial in the development of his theoretical understanding and practical skills in psychological manipulation. The research facilities available to graduate students included sophisticated laboratory equipment and extensive libraries that contained the most current theories and experimental data related to fear response and anxiety disorders. The mentor who would prove most influential in Jonathan's academic development was Professor Harold Pidgeon, a respected researcher whose work in classical conditioning and behavioral modification had earned him recognition within the psychological community, while also providing him with insights into methods for controlling and directing human behavior that went far beyond conventional therapeutic applications. Professor Pidgeon's approach to research combined rigorous scientific methodology with willingness to explore controversial topics that other researchers avoided due to ethical concerns or professional caution. The relationship that developed between Jonathan and his mentor was complex and ultimately tragic, built upon genuine mutual respect for each other's intellectual capabilities, yet corrupted by Jonathan's hidden agenda and Professor Pidgeon's failure to recognize the dangerous applications to which his student was directing supposedly legitimate research. The professor saw in Jonathan a brilliant protege whose dedication to understanding fear mechanisms promised to advance the field significantly, while Jonathan viewed his mentor as both valuable source of knowledge and eventual target for the revenge fantasies that had been building throughout his academic career. The dissertation research that Jonathan conducted under Professor Pidgeon's supervision represented the culmination of his formal education and the beginning of his transition from student to independent researcher capable of pursuing his own agenda without institutional oversight or professional accountability. His chosen topic, the development of more effective treatments for severe phobias through controlled exposure to fear-inducing stimuli, provided perfect cover for investigations that were actually designed to understand how phobias could be artificially created and intensified rather than eliminated through therapeutic intervention. The experimental protocols that Jonathan developed for his dissertation research pushed the boundaries of what university ethics committees would normally approve, yet his reputation for scholarly rigor and Professor Pidgeon's endorsement of his methodology allowed him to gain access to human subjects and laboratory resources that would have been denied to researchers whose true intentions were better understood. The participants in his studies believed they were contributing to the advancement of therapeutic techniques that might help others overcome debilitating fears, not realizing that they were actually serving as test subjects in the development of more effective methods for psychological torture and manipulation. The chemical compounds that Jonathan synthesized during his graduate research represented significant advances over the crude preparations he had developed during his childhood experiments, incorporating sophisticated understanding of neurotransmitter systems and receptor mechanisms that allowed for precise control over fear responses and anxiety levels. His legitimate access to university laboratory facilities and chemical supplies provided him with opportunities to create substances that were far more potent and reliable than anything he could have produced using the limited resources available during his rural isolation. The first human trials of Jonathan's fear-inducing compounds were conducted under the guise of investigating new therapeutic approaches to anxiety disorders, with volunteer subjects believing that they were participating in studies designed to help them overcome their existing phobias through carefully controlled exposure therapy. The consent forms that subjects signed described procedures that sounded routine and beneficial, though Jonathan's actual protocols involved the deliberate triggering of extreme fear responses that provided him with valuable data about the effectiveness of his chemical preparations, while also satisfying his psychological need to observe human suffering under controlled conditions. The results of these early experiments exceeded Jonathan's expectations in terms of both the intensity of fear responses he was able to induce and the precision with which he could control the duration and specific nature of his subjects' psychological experiences. The compounds he had developed could trigger responses ranging from mild anxiety to overwhelming terror, with effects that could be tailored to exploit specific phobias or create entirely new fears through association with previously neutral stimuli. These capabilities represented revolutionary advances in the field of psychological manipulation, though their potential applications were far removed from any legitimate therapeutic purpose. The teaching position that Jonathan accepted following the completion of his doctoral studies provided him with access to new populations of potential research subjects, while also establishing his credentials as a respected member of the Bosing academic community whose research interests appeared to focus on legitimate therapeutic applications rather than the development of psychological weapons. His appointment to the psychology faculty at Gotham University was viewed by his colleagues as recognition of his exceptional scholarly potential and his commitment to advancing understanding of fear mechanisms through innovative research approaches. The classroom environment that Jonathan created for his courses in abnormal psychology and behavioral modification reflected his deep understanding of how fear could be employed to enhance learning, while also providing him with opportunities to observe student responses to various forms of psychological pressure and intimidation. His teaching methods were unconventional but effective, combining traditional academic content with practical demonstrations that gave students first-hand experience of the phenomena they were studying through theoretical analysis alone. The specific incident that would ultimately end Jonathan's legitimate academic career began as what appeared to be a routine classroom demonstration designed to illustrate principles of classical conditioning and fear response, yet escalated into something far more dangerous due to his inability to resist the opportunity to test his latest chemical preparations on a captive audience of unsuspecting students. The boundary between legitimate educational activity and illegal human experimentation had been steadily eroding throughout his academic career, yet this particular incident crossed lines that even his most supportive colleagues could not ignore or excuse. The preparation that Jonathan brought to class that day was described in his lesson plan as a harmless simulation, designed to demonstrate how fear responses could be triggered through environmental manipulation. Yet the actual substance he employed was a concentrated version of his fear toxin that was capable of inducing genuine psychological trauma in subjects who were exposed to even minimal doses. His intention was to create a controlled experience that would provide his students with memorable insights into the nature of fear, while also giving him additional data about the effectiveness of his latest formulation. The disaster that followed Jonathan's activation of his fear-inducing device exceeded even his expectations in terms of the intensity of responses he was able to generate. Yet, the chaos that ensued made systematic observation impossible and transformed what should have been a valuable research opportunity into a public relations catastrophe that threatened his entire career. Several students required emergency medical treatment for anxiety attacks and acute stress reactions, while others suffered psychological trauma that would require extended therapy to resolve completely. The investigation that followed this classroom incident revealed enough about Jonathan's research methods and experimental objectives to raise serious questions about his fitness for continued employment at the university, though the full extent of his illegal activities remained hidden due to his careful maintenance of plausible cover stories and his destruction of the most incriminating evidence. The review committee that evaluated his case concluded that his judgment had been compromised by excessive enthusiasm for his research, but they did not discover the systematic program of human experimentation that had been the true focus of his academic career. The termination of Jonathan's employment at Gotham University was presented as a mutual decision based on his desire to pursue independent research opportunities rather than acknowledgement of professional misconduct that might have resulted in criminal charges if the full truth had been revealed. This face-saving arrangement allowed him to maintain his professional reputation while also providing him with the freedom to pursue his research without the constraints and oversight that had limited his activities during his academic career. The transition from respected professor to independent researcher marked the beginning of Jonathan's final transformation from scholar to criminal, as he used his academic credentials and psychological expertise to establish himself as a consultant, specializing in fear-related disorders, while actually developing the resources and contacts necessary to begin his career as the being who would become known as Scarecrow. The skills and knowledge he had acquired during his years of formal education would prove invaluable in this new phase of his development, though their applications would be far removed from any legitimate therapeutic or educational purpose. The dismissal from Gotham University marked not an ending but a violent metamorphosis in Jonathan Crane's existence, as the carefully constructed facade of academic respectability that had concealed his true nature for so many years finally crumbled beneath the weight of his own psychological compulsions and the institution's belated recognition of the dangerous extremes to which his research had progressed. The man who walked away from the university's Gothic towers was no longer the brilliant professor whose unconventional methods had once been tolerated as the eccentricities of genius, but rather something far more sinister. A predator whose formal education had provided him with sophisticated tools for the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability, and whose personal demons had finally overwhelmed any remaining constraints of professional ethics or social responsibility. The weeks immediately following his termination were characterized by a psychological fragmentation that reflected the collision between Jonathan's carefully maintained public identity and the darker impulses that had always driven his true research agenda, creating a crisis of self-definition that would ultimately resolve itself through the complete abandonment of his former persona in favor of something that more accurately reflected his actual nature and objectives. The professional reputation that he had spent years building became suddenly irrelevant, while the academic credentials that had once opened doors and provided access to resources and subjects transformed into historical artifacts of a life that no longer held any meaning or purpose for the being he was becoming. The isolation that followed his departure from the university was both chosen and imposed, as Jonathan found himself cut off from the social and professional networks that had previously defined his existence. while simultaneously recognizing that such connections had always been mere conveniences rather than genuine relationships based on mutual understanding or affection. The colleagues who had once praised his innovative research approaches now viewed him with suspicion and concern, while the students who had once hung on his every word during lectures whispered among themselves about the terrifying incident that had revealed something fundamentally wrong with their formerly respected professor. The financial resources that Jonathan had accumulated during his academic career, combined with the modest inheritance from Mary Keeney's estate, provided him with sufficient capital to establish an independent research facility where he could pursue his investigations without the oversight and limitations that had increasingly constrained his work during his final years at the final years university. The laboratory that he constructed in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Gotham's industrial district was far more sophisticated than anything he had previously had access to, incorporating equipment and supplies that he acquired through a combination of legitimate purchases and carefully orchestrated thefts from medical and chemical supply companies. The transformation of this industrial space into a functional research facility represented Jonathan's first major project as an independent operator, requiring skills in construction, electrical work, and chemical storage that he had never previously needed to develop yet, which he mastered with the same methodical intensity that had characterized all his academic pursuits. The result was a laboratory that combined cutting-edge analytical capabilities with the kind of operational security that would allow him to conduct experiments that crossed every conceivable ethical boundary without fear of detection or interference from legal authorities. The equipment that Jonathan assembled in his new laboratory reflected both his expanding ambitions and his determination to push his research into areas that no legitimate institution would have permitted him to explore, incorporating devices for chemical synthesis, biological testing, and psychological evaluation that had been acquired through a complex network of suppliers who specialized in serving clients whose research interests exceeded the boundaries of conventional academic inquiry. The chemical storage facilities alone represented a significant investment in materials that ranged from relatively harmless compounds to substances that were classified as controlled or dangerous by federal regulatory agencies. The first projects that Jonathan undertook in his independent laboratory focused on refining and perfecting the fear-inducing compounds that had been the centerpiece of his academic research. Yet with the constraints of university oversight removed, he was able to explore variations and concentrations that would have been considered far too dangerous for testing on human subjects under any legitimate research protocol. The resulting formulations exceeded his previous achievements in terms of both potency and precision, creating substances that could induce specific types of fear responses with unprecedented reliability, while also allowing for careful control over duration and intensity of effects. The testing protocols that Jonathan developed for these enhanced compounds necessarily required access to human subjects who could provide meaningful data about their effectiveness, yet his exclusion from the university environment had eliminated his previous source of volunteer participants who believed they were contributing to legitimate therapeutic research. The solution to this problem required him to venture into areas of Gotham society that he had previously avoided, establishing contacts with individuals whose desperate circumstances or criminal inclinations made them willing to participate in experiments that carried significant risks in exchange for financial compensation. The recruitment of test subjects from Gotham's homeless population and criminal underworld provided Jonathan with access to individuals whose disappearances or claims of unusual experiences would be dismissed by authorities as the ravings of unreliable witnesses, while also giving him first-hand exposure to the social dynamics and power structures that governed the city's darker regions. These interactions taught him valuable lessons about manipulation and intimidation that complemented his academic training in psychology, while also providing him with insights into criminal methodology that would prove essential in his eventual transition from researcher to active predator. The results of these early experiments with his perfected fear compounds exceeded even Jonathan's optimistic projections, demonstrating that he had achieved breakthrough capabilities in the artificial induction of psychological states that could be tailored to exploit specific vulnerabilities or create entirely new phobias through careful application of conditioning techniques. The subjects who survived these trials provided him with detailed accounts of their experiences that allowed him to map the relationship between chemical dosage, environmental factors, and resulting psychological effects with scientific precision. The development of delivery systems for his fear compounds required Jonathan to acquire expertise in areas that had never been part of his formal education, including aerosol technology, time-release mechanisms, and concealed deployment devices that could expose targets to his preparations without their knowledge or consent. The engineering challenges involved in creating reliable and undetectable methods for administering his chemical agents pushed him to develop new skills, while also forcing him to establish relationships with suppliers and fabricators who operated outside the boundaries of legitimate commerce. The prototype devices that emerged from this phase of development represented significant innovations in the field of chemical weapons, though their applications were focused on psychological rather than physical damage, and their effects were intended to create lasting trauma rather than immediate incapacitation. The most successful of these early designs incorporated miniaturized aerosol generators that could be concealed within seemingly innocent objects, allowing for covert deployment in situations where traditional weapons would be impractical or inappropriate. The philosophical framework that Jonathan developed to justify his transition from academic researcher to criminal predator drew heavily upon the psychological insights he had gained during his years of formal study, combined with the traumatic experiences of his childhood that had shaped his understanding of power, relationships, and the fundamental role of fear in human social dynamics. His emerging worldview portrayed conventional morality as a system of control imposed by the weak upon the strong, while characterizing his own activities as a form of scientific inquiry that transcended traditional ethical limitations in pursuit of greater understanding of human psychological mechanisms. The identity crisis that accompanied Jonathan's transformation was resolved through his gradual adoption of the Scarecrow persona, a psychological construct that allowed him to distance himself from the remnants of his former academic identity while embracing aspects of his personality that had been suppressed during his years of professional respectability. The Scarecrow imagery drew consciously upon his traumatic childhood experiences with Mary Keeney's Crow experiments, yet transformed those memories from sources of pain into symbols of power and control over others who would experience similar terror. The physical transformation that accompanied this psychological evolution involved the development of a distinctive appearance and costume that would serve both practical and symbolic purposes in his criminal career, combining elements of academic authority with imagery designed to evoke primal fears of death and supernatural threat. The mask and clothing that he designed incorporated features that would enhance the psychological impact of his presence, while also providing protection against exposure to his own chemical agents during deployment operations. The first criminal activities that Jonathan undertook as Scarecrow were carefully planned operations designed to test both his chemical weapons and his psychological theories under real-world conditions, targeting individuals whose wealth and social position made them attractive subjects for his research, while also providing him with financial resources necessary to fund his continued operations. These early crimes were characterized by elaborate psychological components that went far beyond simple robbery or extortion to encompass systematic campaigns of terror designed to break down his victims' mental resistance and demonstrate his mastery over their deepest fears. The selection of targets for these initial operations reflected Jonathan's desire to revenge himself upon the social class that had rejected him following his dismissal from the university, while also providing him with subjects whose psychological profiles offered interesting challenges for his fear induction techniques. Wealthy businessmen, academic administrators, and other members of Gotham's professional elite became the focus of his attention, their prominence in the community, ensuring that his activities would attract the kind of attention that would establish his reputation as a serious threat requiring law enforcement response. The methodology that Scarecrow employed in these early crimes represented a sophisticated fusion of his academic training with the criminal techniques he had learned through his interactions with Gotham's underworld, creating approaches that were far more complex and psychologically devastating than conventional robberies or assaults. Each operation was preceded by extensive research into the target's personal history, phobias, and vulnerabilities, while the actual crimes themselves were orchestrated as elaborate theater designed to maximize psychological impact, while also achieving specific material objectives. The psychological profiles that Jonathan developed of his early victims revealed patterns of fear and vulnerability that confirmed many of his theoretical predictions about human behavior under extreme stress, while also providing him with new insights into the relationship between social position and psychological resilience that would inform his future target selection. The wealthy and powerful individuals who became his prey often proved to be far more susceptible to fear-based manipulation than their public personas suggested, their confidence and authority crumbling rapidly when confronted with threats that operated outside the normal parameters of their experience. The financial success of these early criminal operations provided Jonathan with resources that far exceeded what his academic salary had ever offered, while also validating his belief that his psychological expertise could be monetized through applications that conventional society would never have permitted him to pursue. The money he obtained through extortion and theft allowed him to expand his laboratory facilities and acquire more sophisticated equipment, while also providing him with the capital necessary to recruit assistants and expand his operations beyond what he could accomplish working alone. The recruitment of criminal associates who could assist in his increasingly ambitious schemes required Jonathan to navigate the complex social dynamics of Gotham's underworld, establishing relationships with individuals whose skills complemented his own while maintaining the kind of psychological dominance necessary to ensure their loyalty and obedience. The men and women who eventually joined his organization were drawn primarily from the ranks of failed academics and disgraced professionals, whose personal circumstances made them receptive to his promises of wealth and power in exchange for participation in activities that conventional society would condemn. The organizational structure that Scarecrow developed for his criminal enterprise reflected his academic background and his understanding of institutional hierarchy, creating chains of command and operational procedures that allowed for efficient coordination of complex criminal activities, while also maintaining the security necessary to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies. His followers were trained in both the technical aspects of chemical weapons deployment and the psychological techniques necessary to maximize the effectiveness of fear-based intimidation campaigns. The evolution of Jonathan's criminal methodology during this period reflected his growing confidence in his abilities and his increasing willingness to pursue objectives that went beyond simple financial gain to encompass broader goals related to his research interests and his desire to demonstrate his intellectual superiority over those who had rejected him. The crimes that he orchestrated became more elaborate and psychologically sophisticated, incorporating elements of performance art and scientific experimentation that transformed criminal activity into opportunities for advancing his understanding of fear psychology. The attention that Scarecrow's activities attracted from Gotham's law enforcement community marked the beginning of his transition from local criminal to significant threat requiring specialized response capabilities, as conventional police methods proved inadequate for dealing with an adversary whose weapons and tactics operated primarily in the psychological rather than physical realm. The confusion and panic that his early crimes created among both victims and investigators demonstrated the effectiveness of his approach, while also revealing the extent to which traditional crime-fighting strategies were unprepared for opponents who understood how to weaponize fear itself. The media coverage that accompanied Scarecrow's emergence as a major criminal figure provided him with the kind of public recognition that his academic career had never offered, transforming him from obscure researcher into notorious figure whose very name became associated with terror and psychological manipulation throughout Gotham City. This notoriety served his purposes by enhancing the psychological impact of his presence and reputation, while also attracting the attention of other criminals who recognized the potential value of his unique capabilities. The psychological satisfaction that Jonathan derived from his transformation into Scarecrow went far beyond the material benefits of his criminal success to encompass a sense of personal fulfillment that had been absent throughout his academic career, as he finally found outlets for the darker aspects of his personality that professional respectability had forced him to suppress. The fear and suffering that he created through his activities provided him with validation of his theories while also satisfying psychological needs that legitimate research had never addressed. The realization that he had found his true calling in the systematic exploitation of human psychological vulnerability marked the completion of Jonathan Crane's metamorphosis from frustrated academic into criminal mastermind. Yet this transformation also represented the beginning of an even more significant evolution that would eventually bring him into conflict with forces that would challenge his understanding of fear and power in ways that no university, oversight committee, or police investigation ever could. The emergence of Scarecrow as a force within Gotham's criminal landscape coincided with the city's gradual recognition that it faced a new category of threat entirely, one that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of criminal motivation and methodology, while employing weapons that attacked the mind rather than the body, creating forms of damage that could not be measured through traditional metrics of physical harm or material loss. The transformation of Jonathan Crane from disgraced academic into criminal mastermind had produced something unprecedented in the annals of urban crime, a predator whose sophistication in psychological manipulation exceeded that of trained professionals, yet whose moral constraints had been so thoroughly eroded that no consideration of human welfare or social responsibility could influence his pursuit of objectives that served only his own twisted research agenda and his insatiable hunger for revenge against a world that had failed to recognize his superiority. The criminal organization that Scarecrow assembled during this period reflected his understanding of both academic hierarchy and underworld power dynamics, creating a structure that combined elements of university research departments with the operational security and ruthless efficiency that characterized the most successful criminal enterprises in Gotham's history. His recruitment of associates focused on individuals whose professional backgrounds provided them with skills that complemented his own expertise in psychology and chemistry, while their personal circumstances made them receptive to his promises of wealth and status in exchange for participation in activities that pushed the boundaries of criminal law into entirely new territories of moral transgression. The lieutenants who formed the core of Scarecrow's organization included former graduate students whose academic careers had been destroyed by scandals or failures, disgraced medical professionals who had lost their licenses due to ethical violations, and chemists whose expertise in pharmaceutical research had been tainted by involvement in illegal drug manufacturing or human experimentation. These individuals brought legitimate credentials and advanced technical knowledge to his criminal enterprise, while their own psychological damage and moral flexibility made them ideal collaborators in projects that required complete abandonment of conventional ethical standards. The operational protocols that Scarecrow developed for his organization were based on academic research methodologies adapted for criminal applications, with each major crime serving as both revenue-generating activity and scientific experiment designed to advance his understanding of fear psychology, while also testing new formulations of his chemical weapons under real-world conditions. The systematic documentation of results from these operations provided him with data that would have been impossible to obtain through legitimate research channels, while also allowing him to refine his techniques and develop increasingly sophisticated approaches to psychological manipulation. The laboratory facilities that served as the nerve center of Scarecrow's criminal empire had expanded far beyond the original warehouse installation to encompass a network of hidden research sites throughout Gotham's industrial districts, each specialized for different aspects of his ongoing projects in chemical weapons development, psychological research, and criminal planning. The primary facility included sophisticated equipment for chemical synthesis and biological testing that rivaled the capabilities of major pharmaceutical companies, while smaller satellite locations provided secure storage for dangerous materials and backup facilities that could continue operations if the main laboratory was discovered by law enforcement. The chemical formulations that emerged from this expanded research effort represented quantum leaps in the effectiveness and versatility of Scarecrow's fear-inducing compounds, incorporating advances in neuropharmacology and psychoactive chemistry that allowed for precise targeting of specific brain regions and neurotransmitter systems associated with different types of fear responses. The resulting substances could induce everything from mild anxiety to complete psychological breakdown, with effects that could be calibrated to last anywhere from minutes to months depending upon dosage and delivery method. The most significant breakthrough in Scarecrow's chemical weapons research was the development of airborne formulations that could affect large populations simultaneously, transforming his fear toxin from a weapon that required direct application to individual targets into a tool for mass psychological warfare capable of paralyzing entire city blocks or building complexes through coordinated deployment of aerosol dispensers. These airborne variants required extensive testing to ensure stability and effectiveness under various environmental conditions. Experiments that necessitated field trials conducted on unwitting civilian populations throughout Gotham's less affluent neighborhoods. The delivery systems that Scarecrow's organization developed for these advanced chemical weapons incorporated cutting-edge technology acquired through theft from military contractors and aerospace companies, creating devices that could deploy fear toxin through building ventilation systems, water supplies, or atmospheric dispersal methods that made detection and countermeasures extremely difficult for conventional law enforcement agencies. The engineering sophistication of these weapons systems reflected the talents of his recruited associates, while also demonstrating his own evolution from academic researcher to military-grade psychological warfare specialist. The targeting strategies that Scarecrow employed during this period reflected both his personal vendetta against Gotham's social and academic elite and his scientific interest in studying fear responses across different demographic groups and psychological profiles, creating a campaign of terror that served multiple objectives, while also providing him with comprehensive data about the effectiveness of his methods against various types of victims. His attacks on university administrators, wealthy businessmen, and government officials were carefully orchestrated to maximize both psychological impact and research value, while also generating the financial resources necessary to fund his expanding operations. The first major confrontation between Scarecrow and Batman occurred during one of these carefully planned operations against a gathering of Gotham's academic and business elite, an event that had been selected as a target both for its symbolic significance in Jonathan's personal mythology and for its potential to provide data about fear responses in high-achieving individuals who were accustomed to positions of power and control. The psychological profiles that he had developed of the attendees suggested that their confidence and social status would make them particularly vulnerable to fear-based attacks that challenged their sense of security and Bysid's competence. The deployment of fear toxin at this gathering created chaos that exceeded even Scarecrow's expectations, as the concentrated dose of his latest formulation triggered panic responses that transformed distinguished professionals into terror-stricken individuals whose behavior provided him with valuable insights into the relationship between social conditioning and psychological resilience under extreme stress. The resulting mayhem attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies throughout the city, while also drawing the intervention of Gotham's mysterious vigilante protector, whose reputation for dealing with unusual criminal threats had been growing steadily throughout the previous months. Batman's arrival at the scene of Scarecrow's attack marked the beginning of a conflict that would define both characters' development for years to come, as the Dark Knight's methods of intimidation and fear-based crime fighting proved surprisingly vulnerable to psychological weapons that exploited the very techniques that he employed against conventional criminals. The confrontation revealed that Batman's effectiveness against ordinary lawbreakers was partially dependent upon his ability to inspire fear in opponents who were psychologically normal, yet Scarecrow's complete absence of conventional fear responses and his expertise in manipulating terror as a weapon created a strategic situation unlike anything the vigilante had previously encountered. The chemical agents that Scarecrow deployed against Batman during this initial confrontation were specifically formulated to target the psychological vulnerabilities that his research had identified in individuals who employed fear as a tool of control, compounds that could bypass normal defensive mechanisms and trigger responses based on repressed traumas and unconscious anxieties. The resulting exposure provided him with unprecedented opportunities to study the fear responses of someone whose psychological profile combined exceptional training and mental discipline with underlying trauma patterns that created exploitable weakness. The data that Scarecrow collected from his encounters with Batman revealed psychological dynamics that exceeded his most optimistic projections about the research value of engaging with Gotham's vigilante protector, providing him with insights into fear psychology that could never have been obtained through conventional experimental subjects or criminal targets. The Dark Knight's unique combination of extraordinary capabilities and profound psychological damage made him an ideal case study for advanced fear manipulation techniques, while also presenting challenges that pushed Scarecrow to develop new approaches and more sophisticated chemical formulations. The escalation of conflict between these two masters of fear-based psychology created a dynamic that transcended simple criminal activity to become a form of psychological warfare that threatened the stability of Gotham's social fabric, while also advancing the boundaries of what was scientifically possible in the field of induced terror and mind control. Each encounter between them provided both combatants with new information about their opponent's capabilities and vulnerabilities, creating an evolutionary arms race in techniques of intimidation and psychological manipulation that benefited from the unique expertise that both brought to their confrontations. The criminal alliance that Scarecrow formed with other members of Gotham's emerging rogues gallery reflected his recognition that his psychological expertise could be enhanced through collaboration with individuals whose own specialized capabilities complemented his mastery of fear-based attacks, creating combinations of threats that were far more dangerous than any single criminal could pose operating independently. These partnerships were carefully negotiated arrangements that maximized mutual benefits while maintaining operational security and protecting each participant's core interests and research objectives. The most significant of these criminal collaborations involved Scarecrow's alliance with Lex Luthor's various enterprises, relationships that provided him with access to advanced technology and financial resources in exchange for psychological consultation services that enhanced the effectiveness of Luthor's own schemes against Superman and other superhuman targets. The combination of Scarecrow's expertise in fear manipulation with Luthor's technological resources created hybrid weapons systems that represented unprecedented threats to both conventional law enforcement and superhuman defenders. The expansion of Scarecrow's operations beyond Gotham City limits reflected his growing confidence in his abilities and his recognition that his research objectives could be advanced through experiments conducted on populations that lacked the psychological conditioning and vigilante protection that characterized his home territory. The fear toxin attacks that he orchestrated in other metropolitan areas provided him with comparative data about regional variations in fear responses, while also establishing his reputation as a national-level threat requiring federal law enforcement attention. The technological innovations that emerged from Scarecrow's research during this period included breakthrough developments in psychoactive chemistry that attracted interest from military and intelligence agencies seeking advanced interrogation techniques and crowd control methods, though these official inquiries were necessarily conducted through intermediaries who could maintain plausible deniability about their government connections. The potential applications of his fear-inducing compounds for military and intelligence purposes provided him with additional revenue streams, while also validating his belief that his research possessed genuine strategic value beyond its criminal applications. The psychological transformation that Jonathan continued to undergo during this period reflected his complete absorption into the Scarecrow persona, as the remnants of his academic identity were systematically eliminated in favor of an integrated criminal personality that combined intellectual sophistication with complete moral flexibility and an insatiable appetite for conducting experiments that caused suffering on unprecedented scales. The man who had once sought recognition through legitimate scholarly achievement had evolved into something far more dangerous, a predator whose understanding of human psychology exceeded that of trained professionals, yet whose empathy had been so thoroughly corrupted that other people's pain served only as data points in his ongoing research. The legacy of trauma that had shaped Jonathan's earliest development continued to influence his criminal methodology, yet these childhood experiences now served as sources of strength rather than vulnerability, providing him with insights into the mechanisms of psychological control that allowed him to achieve effects that other criminals could never duplicate through conventional intimidation or violence. The systematic abuse that he had endured under Mary Keeney's supervision had taught him lessons about the relationship between fear and power that no academic program could have provided, creating expertise that was literally purchased through suffering and refined through years of careful study and practical application. The financial success of Scarecrow's criminal enterprise during this period provided him with resources that exceeded those available to most legitimate research institutions, allowing him to pursue projects that would have been impossible under conventional funding constraints, while also maintaining the operational security necessary to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies that were gradually developing more sophisticated approaches to dealing with his unique threat profile. The wealth that he accumulated through extortion, theft, and consultation services was reinvested primarily in expanding his research capabilities rather than personal luxury, reflecting his continued commitment to advancing his understanding of fear psychology regardless of cost in human suffering or social stability. The scientific papers that Scarecrow published under various pseudonyms in obscure academic journals represented his attempts to maintain some connection to the legitimate research community, while also advancing theories and methodologies that could never have been developed through ethical, experimental protocols. These publications, which described breakthrough discoveries in fear psychology, without revealing the illegal human experimentation that had generated the data, attracted attention from researchers worldwide who recognized the significance of the findings while remaining ignorant of their criminal origins. The culmination of this period in Scarecrow's development was marked by his emergence as one of Gotham's most feared and respected criminal masterminds, a figure whose reputation for psychological sophistication and innovative methodology attracted both admiration and terror from other members of the city's underworld, while also establishing him as a priority target for law enforcement agencies that recognized the unprecedented nature of the threat he represented to public safety and social order. The corridors of Arkham Asylum had witnessed countless forms of madness throughout their sordid history, yet the arrival of Jonathan Crane as a permanent resident marked the beginning of a new chapter in the institution's catalogue of horrors. As the former professor's expertise in psychological manipulation and chemical experimentation transformed his incarceration from simple punishment into an opportunity to conduct research that would have been impossible in any other environment. The asylum's population of damaged minds and desperate souls provided him with an unlimited supply of test subjects whose pre-existing mental instabilities made them ideal candidates for experiments in fear, enhancement, and psychological control. While the institutional chaos and understaffing that characterized Arkham's daily operations created conditions that allowed determined inmates to pursue activities far beyond what their official confinement should have permitted. The psychological evaluation that preceded Scarecrow's initial commitment to Arkham revealed a mind that had achieved complete integration of his criminal persona with his academic identity, creating a unified consciousness that viewed his illegal activities not as moral transgressions, but as necessary components of legitimate scientific inquiry that happened to operate outside conventional, institutional frameworks. The psychiatrists who conducted these assessments found themselves confronting an individual whose understanding of psychological principles exceeded their own professional training, yet whose moral development had been so thoroughly corrupted that he could discuss the most heinous acts with the same detached analytical perspective that characterizes academic discourse in theoretical subjects. The treatment protocols that Arkham's medical staff developed for managing Scarecrow's case reflected their recognition that conventional therapeutic approaches would be ineffective against someone whose pathology was rooted not in psychological dysfunction, but in the systematic application of advanced knowledge to morally reprehensible objectives. The medications prescribed for his condition were designed more to sedate and control rather than cure, while the therapy sessions that were mandated by his commitment order became exercises in intellectual sparring between professionals who understood they were dealing with someone whose expertise in their own field potentially exceeded their ability to help or contain him. The cell that became Scarecrow's primary residence within Arkham had been specially modified to prevent the kind of chemical experimentation that had characterized his external, criminal activities. Yet these security measures proved inadequate against an individual whose understanding of improvised chemistry allowed him to create psychoactive compounds from materials that were readily available within the institutional environment. The cleaning supplies, medications, and even food additives that comprised the asylum's daily inventory became raw materials for continued research, while the ventilation systems and plumbing infrastructure provided distribution networks for deploying his creations throughout the facility. The other inmates who populated Arkham during Scarecrow's residency represented a unique research opportunity that far exceeded anything he had previously encountered, as their pre-existing psychological conditions provided him with naturally occurring variations in brain chemistry and fear response that could be studied and manipulated through careful application of his expanding repertoire of psychoactive substances. The man who called himself the Joker proved particularly fascinating as a research subject, displaying psychological patterns that seemed to represent the complete absence of normal fear responses, yet also exhibiting obsessive behaviors that suggested underlying anxieties that might be exploited through sufficiently sophisticated manipulation. The informal network that Scarecrow established among his fellow inmates reflected his understanding that criminal collaboration could continue even within the constraints of institutional confinement, creating alliances that served both immediate practical purposes and longer-term research objectives, while also providing him with the social dynamics necessary to test theories about group psychology and collective fear responses. His position as the most intellectually sophisticated member of Arkham's population made him a natural leader among inmates who recognized that his expertise could be valuable in planning escapes or settling disputes with rival factions within the asylum's social hierarchy. The staff members who worked at Arkham found themselves gradually succumbing to various forms of psychological manipulation that Scarecrow employed to gain access to materials and information that should have been beyond his reach, as his understanding of institutional psychology allowed him to identify and exploit the personal vulnerabilities of guards, nurses, and administrators whose own psychological problems had drawn them to work in such a challenging environment. The techniques he used ranged from subtle forms of suggestion and persuasion to more direct applications of chemical influence, creating a web of corruption and control that extended throughout the asylum's operational structure. The medical experiments that Scarecrow conducted within Arkham were disguised as therapeutic activities or research projects that appeared to serve legitimate institutional purposes while actually advancing his understanding of how psychological trauma could be induced and manipulated through chemical intervention, combined with environmental conditioning. The data he collected from these covert experiments provided him with insights that would have been impossible to obtain through legitimate research channels, while also allowing him to refine his techniques and develop new approaches that could be applied during future criminal activities outside the asylum's walls. The escape attempts that punctuated Scarecrow's tenure at Arkham were characteristically elaborate affairs that combined careful planning with psychological warfare designed to create maximum chaos and confusion among staff members, while also serving as practical tests of his latest chemical formulations and fear induction techniques. These breakouts were orchestrated not merely to achieve freedom, but to demonstrate his intellectual superiority over the security systems and personnel that were supposed to contain him, creating spectacles that enhanced his reputation among both criminal associates and law enforcement agencies. The most significant of these escape incidents involved the systematic poisoning of the asylum's water supply with a concentrated dose of fear toxin that created mass hysteria among both inmates and staff, transforming the entire facility into a laboratory for studying panic responses under controlled conditions. while also providing cover for his departure from the premises. The resulting chaos took weeks to resolve completely, and provided him with comprehensive data about the effectiveness of airborne fear agents in enclosed environments populated by individuals with pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities. The periods of freedom that followed these escapes allowed Scarecrow to apply the knowledge he had gained through his research within Arkham to increasingly sophisticated criminal schemes that demonstrated his continued evolution as both scientist and predator, incorporating insights about institutional psychology and group dynamics that made his attacks more effective while also more difficult for law enforcement agencies to anticipate and counter. His understanding of how fear propagated through social networks and institutional hierarchies allowed him to create panic responses that extended far beyond his immediate targets to encompass entire communities and organizations. The recaptures that inevitably followed these criminal campaigns provided Arkham staff with opportunities to study Scarecrow's methods and develop more effective containment procedures. Yet, each return to the asylum also gave him access to new research, subjects, and opportunities to refine his techniques. Through continued experimentation on the facility's population of mentally disturbed individuals, the cyclical pattern of escape, crime, and recapture became a rhythm that served his research agenda, while also demonstrating the inadequacy of conventional institutional responses to criminals whose expertise exceeded the capabilities of the systems designed to contain them. The influence that Scarecrow wielded over other inmates during his periods of confinement extended beyond simple leadership or criminal alliance to encompass systematic programs of psychological conditioning that transformed fellow prisoners into extensions of his research apparatus, creating networks of informants and experimental subjects who continued to serve his purposes even when he was physically absent from the facility. The techniques he used to achieve this level of control combined his academic understanding of behavioral modification with the practical insights he had gained about institutional power dynamics through years of observation and experimentation. The corruption of Arkham's therapeutic programs through Scarecrow's influence represented perhaps his most insidious achievement during his periods of confinement, as he systematically subverted treatment protocols designed to help mentally ill individuals in favor of procedures that enhanced their psychological damage, while also advancing his understanding of how trauma could be weaponized and deployed against targeted populations. The group therapy sessions that were intended to provide healing and support became laboratories for studying collective fear responses, while individual counseling appointments were transformed into opportunities for gathering intelligence about staff vulnerabilities and institutional security procedures. The chemical synthesis that Scarecrow continued to pursue within the apparently secure environment of his cell required ingenuity and resourcefulness that demonstrated his complete mastery of improvised laboratory techniques, as he learned to extract and concentrate psychoactive compounds from materials that were readily available within the asylum, while also developing new delivery methods that could bypass the security measures designed to prevent exactly such activities. The resulting formulations often exceeded the potency and sophistication of preparations he had created in fully equipped external laboratories, representing triumph of intellect and determination over institutional constraints. The psychological profiles that Scarecrow developed of Arkham's staff members through careful observation and strategic interaction provided him with comprehensive intelligence about the personal histories, family relationships, and individual fears that could be exploited to gain cooperation or eliminate obstacles to his research agenda. This information was collected through methods that combined formal psychological assessment techniques with more intuitive forms of analysis based on behavioral observation and strategic conversation, creating detailed maps of vulnerability that could be used to predict and control staff behavior under various circumstances. The alliances that Scarecrow formed with other high-profile inmates represented mutually beneficial arrangements that provided him with protection and resources, while also giving his criminal associates access to his expertise in psychological manipulation and chemical warfare, creating collaborations that enhanced the capabilities of all participants, while also making them more dangerous to both institutional security and eventual targets of their coordinated criminal activities. The most significant of these partnerships involved individuals whose own specialized knowledge complemented his understanding of fear psychology, creating hybrid approaches that combined different forms of criminal expertise into unprecedented threat profiles. The documentation that Scarecrow maintained of his research activities within Arkham was hidden throughout the facility, using techniques that combined his understanding of institutional architecture with innovative concealment methods that ensured his data would survive even extensive security sweeps and facility searches. These records included detailed experimental protocols, subject response data, and theoretical analyses that represented years of accumulated knowledge about psychological manipulation and chemical mind control, creating archives that could support continued research even if he were permanently separated from his laboratory materials and equipment. The reputation that Scarecrow developed among Arkham's population as both protector and predator reflected the complex dynamics of institutional life and the way that superior intelligence and useful skills could translate into social power even within the constraints of psychiatric confinement. His ability to provide other inmates with chemical substances that could enhance their own criminal activities or simply provide temporary escape from their psychological suffering made him a valuable ally, while his demonstrated willingness to use his expertise for punishment and revenge ensured that potential enemies understood the costs of opposition. The evolutionary pressure that Arkham's security measures placed on Scarecrow's research methods forced him to develop increasingly sophisticated and subtle techniques that could achieve his objectives without triggering the kind of obvious responses that would lead to enhanced containment procedures or transfer to more secure facilities. This institutional arms race between criminal ingenuity and administrative countermeasures drove innovations in both psychological manipulation and security protocols, creating a dynamic that benefited from the expertise and determination of both sides, while also demonstrating the fundamental challenges involved in containing individuals whose criminal capabilities were based on advanced knowledge rather than simple violence or resource advantages. The long-term impact of Scarecrow's presence within Arkham extended far beyond his individual criminal activities to encompass systematic changes in the institution's culture and operational procedures that reflected the corrosive influence of prolonged exposure to sophisticated psychological manipulation and the gradual erosion of professional standards that occurred when staff members were regularly subjected to fear-based attacks on their mental stability and emotional security. The asylum that eventually emerged from years of his residence was fundamentally different from the therapeutic institution it had originally been designed to be, transformed instead into something that more closely resembled a research facility dedicated to the study and application of psychological warfare techniques against vulnerable populations. The culmination of Scarecrow's criminal evolution reached its most terrifying zenith during the period when his mastery of fear psychology and chemical warfare converged with his growing ambition to conduct experiments on a scale that would dwarf all previous attempts at mass psychological manipulation, transforming him from a criminal who used terror as a tool for personal enrichment into something far more dangerous, a researcher whose subjects encompassed entire populations and whose laboratory had expanded to include the streets, buildings, and infrastructure of Gotham City itself. The man who had once been content to terrorize individual victims or small groups now turned his attention to projects that would test his theories about collective fear responses and social breakdown on unprecedented scales, creating campaigns of terror that threatened not merely lives and property, but the very psychological foundations upon which civilized society depended for its continued existence. The technological infrastructure that Scarecrow had developed during his years of criminal activity had evolved into a sophisticated network of chemical manufacturing facilities, delivery systems, and command centers that rivaled the capabilities of military organizations, while remaining hidden within Gotham's sprawling industrial landscape through careful use of front companies and legitimate business operations that served as cover for his more sinister activities. The laboratories that comprised this network were equipped with state-of-the-art chemical synthesis equipment that allowed for the mass production of fear toxin in quantities sufficient to affect thousands of people simultaneously, while the delivery systems he had perfected could deploy these substances through water supplies, ventilation systems, or atmospheric dispersal methods that made detection and countermeasures extremely difficult for conventional emergency response agencies. The criminal organization that supported these expanded operations had grown beyond the small cadre of disgraced professionals who had formed his original inner circle to encompass a complex hierarchy of specialists whose expertise ranged from chemical engineering and logistics to psychological warfare and urban terrorism, creating an enterprise that functioned with the efficiency and sophistication of a multinational corporation, while maintaining the operational security and moral flexibility that characterized the most dangerous criminal conspiracies. The recruitment of new members continued to focus on individuals whose professional backgrounds provided them with skills that complemented the organization's objectives. Yet the screening process had become more rigorous as the stakes of discovery had increased alongside the scale and ambition of their planned operations. The financial resources that funded Scarecrow's expanded activities came from increasingly sophisticated criminal schemes that combined traditional extortion and theft with more innovative approaches that exploited his unique capabilities in psychological manipulation and chemical warfare, creating revenue streams that provided the substantial capital necessary to support his research, while also demonstrating the commercial viability of fear-based criminal methodologies. The contracts that he accepted from other criminal organizations and corrupt government agencies provided additional funding, while also expanding his research opportunities through access to new populations of potential test subjects and different operational environments that challenged his frames, theories and techniques in novel ways. The first of his truly large-scale operations targeted Gotham's financial district during a period of economic uncertainty that made the population particularly susceptible to panic responses, as the combination of existing anxiety about market conditions with the artificial enhancement of fear through chemical intervention created a psychological perfect storm that demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of his approach, while also providing him with comprehensive data about how terror propagated through densely populated urban environments. The deployment of airborne fear toxin throughout the district's major office buildings created scenes of chaos that exceeded even his optimistic projections as normally rational business professionals were transformed into panic-stricken individuals whose behavior provided valuable insights into the relationship between social status and psychological resilience under extreme stress. The methodology that Scarecrow employed for this financial district operation reflected years of refinement in both chemical formulation and delivery techniques, incorporating lessons learned from smaller-scale experiments, while also introducing innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible in the field of chemical weapons deployment. The fear toxin used in this attack was specifically designed to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of high-achieving individuals who were accustomed to positions of control and authority, creating formulations that were calibrated to trigger responses based on professional anxieties and social status fears that would be most devastating to the target population. The results of this large-scale experiment provided Scarecrow with data that validated many of his theoretical predictions about mass psychology, while also revealing unexpected patterns in collective fear responses that opened new avenues for research and application, particularly regarding the way that panic propagated through social networks and institutional hierarchies when normal communication and authority structures were disrupted by chemical intervention. The economic impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate chaos to encompass lasting changes in business confidence and investment patterns that demonstrated how psychological warfare could achieve strategic objectives that would, beyond the may, be impossible through conventional criminal methods. The law enforcement response to this financial district incident marked a significant escalation in the resources and attention that government agencies devoted to countering Scarecrow's activities, as federal authorities recognized that his capabilities had evolved beyond local criminal threats to encompass potential terrorism and national security implications that required specialized response capabilities and interagency coordination. The investigation that followed the attack revealed the sophisticated nature of his organization and the advanced technical capabilities that supported his operations, leading to increased funding for research into chemical defense measures and improved emergency response protocols for dealing with psychological warfare attacks. The success of the financial district operation encouraged Scarecrow to pursue even more ambitious projects that would test the limits of his theoretical understanding, while also providing opportunities to study fear responses in different demographic groups and social environments, creating a research agenda that combined scientific curiosity with increasingly grandiose visions of his role as a pioneer in the field of applied terror psychology. The next phase of his campaign focused on Gotham's educational institutions, targeting universities and schools with chemical attacks that were designed to study how fear affected learning and cognitive development, while also striking at the academic community that had once rejected his legitimate research efforts. The attacks on educational facilities required different technical approaches than the financial district operation, as the younger demographic and different environmental conditions necessitated modifications in both chemical formulation and delivery methodology to achieve optimal results, while also accounting for the ethical complexities involved in using children and young adults as experimental subjects. The fear toxin deployed in these attacks was calibrated to exploit developmental anxieties and academic pressures that were specific to student populations, creating psychological experiences that would provide unique data about fear responses in individuals whose identity formation was still in progress. The psychological impact of these educational attacks extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass parents, teachers, and community members whose own fears about child safety and institutional security were amplified by media coverage and official responses that struggled to address threats that operated outside conventional understanding of school, violence, and public safety. The resulting climate of anxiety and suspicion created secondary research opportunities that allowed Scarecrow to study how fear propagated through family and community networks when normal sources of security and authority were perceived as inadequate to protect vulnerable populations. The data collected from these educational experiments provided Scarecrow with insights that significantly advanced his understanding of developmental psychology and the ways that traumatic experiences during crucial growth periods could shape personality, development, and behavioral patterns. Throughout the lifespan, information that had obvious applications for creating more effective fear induction techniques, while also contributing to his growing comprehension of how his own childhood trauma had influenced his psychological development and criminal methodology. The recognition of these parallels between his research subjects and his own experiences added personal dimensions to his scientific work that made his attacks more emotionally satisfying, while also providing validation for his belief that fear was the fundamental force that shaped all human behavior and social organization. The expansion of Scarecrow's operations to include attacks on healthcare facilities represented both escalation in the scope of his criminal activities and evolution in his research interests toward questions about how fear affected physical health and medical treatment, creating opportunities to study psychosomatic responses and the relationship between psychological terror and physiological breakdown in controlled clinical environments. The hospitals and medical centers that became his targets provided access to populations that were already experiencing stress and vulnerability due to illness or injury, making them ideal subjects for experiments in fear enhancement, while also allowing him to observe how terror affected the healing process and medical outcomes. The technical challenges involved in attacking healthcare facilities required innovations in chemical delivery that could bypass medical air filtration systems and neutralize standard emergency response protocols, while also accounting for the presence of patients whose medical conditions might make them more susceptible to adverse reactions from fear toxin exposure. The formulations developed for these attacks included variants that were specifically designed to interact with common medications and medical treatments, creating synergistic effects that amplified fear responses while also providing data about drug interactions and chemical compatibility that advanced his understanding of psychoactive chemistry. The psychological warfare that Scarecrow conducted against Batman during this period represented the culmination of years of study and observation, as he had developed comprehensive profiles of the Dark Knight's psychological vulnerabilities and had perfected chemical formulations that were specifically designed to exploit the trauma patterns and anxiety responses that characterized Gotham's vigilante protector. The encounters between these two masters of fear-based psychology had evolved beyond simple criminal confrontations to become elaborate experimental scenarios that tested the limits of both participants' capabilities, while also advancing Scarecrow's research into the psychology of heroism and the ways that traumatic experiences could be channeled into socially beneficial rather than destructive behaviors. The fear toxin variants that Scarecrow developed specifically for use against Batman incorporated his most advanced understanding of neuropharmacology and psychological manipulation, creating substances that could bypass the enhanced mental discipline and conditioning that normally protected the Dark Knight from fear-based attacks, while also exploiting the specific trauma patterns that drove his vigilante activities. These personalized chemical weapons represented the pinnacle of his research achievements, combining years of theoretical study with practical observation to create tools that were precisely calibrated to achieve maximum psychological impact against a specific individual target. The results of these encounters with Batman provided Scarecrow with data that exceeded his most optimistic expectations about the research value of engaging with exceptional individuals whose psychological profiles combined extraordinary capabilities with profound trauma histories, revealing patterns and responses that contributed significantly to his understanding of how fear could be used to control or neutralize even the most formidable opponents. The knowledge gained from these experiments enhanced his reputation among criminal associates, while also providing practical intelligence that could be applied to future conflicts with law enforcement agencies and superhuman adversaries. The collaboration networks that Scarecrow established with other members of Gotham's criminal community during this period reflected his recognition that his psychological expertise could be enhanced through partnerships with individuals whose own specialized capabilities created opportunities for more sophisticated and devastating attacks than any single criminal could achieve operating independently. The alliances he formed with figures like the Joker, Poison Ivy, and various members of organized crime syndicates provided him with access to additional resources and expertise, while also creating opportunities to study group dynamics and collective psychology in criminal organizations. The most significant of these criminal partnerships involved extended collaborations with Lex Luthor's various enterprises, relationships that provided Scarecrow with access to advanced technology and global resources in exchange for psychological consultation services that enhanced the effectiveness of Luthor's schemes against Superman and other superhuman targets. The combination of Luthor's technological capabilities with Scarecrow's expertise in psychological manipulation created hybrid weapons systems and strategic approaches that represented unprecedented threats to both human and superhuman defenders. The international expansion of Scarecrow's activities during this period reflected his growing confidence in his capabilities and his recognition that his research objectives could be advanced through experiments conducted on diverse populations that possessed different cultural backgrounds and psychological conditioning than the subjects available in Gotham City. The fear toxin attacks that he orchestrated in major cities throughout the world provided him with comparative data about cultural variations in fear responses, while also establishing his reputation as a global threat requiring international law enforcement cooperation. The technological innovations that emerged from Scarecrow's research during this peak period included breakthrough developments in psychoactive chemistry and delivery systems that attracted covert interest from military and intelligence agencies seeking advanced interrogation techniques and crowd control methods, though these official inquiries were necessarily conducted through intermediaries who could maintain plausible deniability about government involvement in illegal human experimentation. The potential military applications of his fear-inducing compounds provided additional validation of his research, while also creating opportunities for official sanctioning of activities that would otherwise be considered criminal. The philosophical framework that Scarecrow had developed to justify his increasingly ambitious and destructive activities drew upon his academic background in psychology, while also incorporating insights gained through years of practical experience in criminal methodology and psychological warfare, creating a worldview that portrayed fear as the fundamental organizing principle of human society and characterized his own activities as necessary research into the mechanisms that truly governed social behavior beneath the facade of civilization and moral restraint. This theoretical justification for his actions provided psychological satisfaction while also serving practical purposes in recruiting associates and maintaining organizational cohesion among individuals whose participation in his schemes required some form of intellectual rationalization for their criminal activities. The legacy of terror that Scarecrow created through these peak period operations established him as one of the most feared and respected criminal masterminds in history, a figure whose innovations in psychological warfare and chemical weapons development had fundamentally changed the nature of criminal threat, while also advancing scientific understanding of fear, psychology, and mass manipulation techniques in ways that would influence both legitimate research and criminal methodology for generations to come. The data and methodologies that emerged from his campaigns represented genuine contributions to knowledge, albeit acquired through means that violated every ethical standard and legal constraint that governed legitimate scientific inquiry. The personal satisfaction that Jonathan derived from these achievements went beyond simple criminal success or research validation to encompass a sense of historical significance and intellectual legacy that provided meaning and purpose to his existence, while also validating the traumatic experiences of his childhood through their transformation into sources of unique knowledge and capability that no conventional education or social development could have provided. The recognition that his suffering had been transformed into expertise that exceeded the capabilities of normally developed individuals created a form of psychological resolution that made his criminal career feel like destiny rather than choice. The transformation of Jonathan Crane's terrifying legacy from the confined realm of comic book pages into the broader landscape of popular culture represented a phenomenon that transcended simple adaptation to become a fundamental reimagining of how fear itself could be portrayed and understood across different media, each interpretation adding layers of complexity and psychological depth that revealed new aspects of the character, while also reflecting the evolving concerns and anxieties of the societies that created and consumed these various manifestations. The journey of Scarecrow from his original comic book origins through television, film, video games, and other forms of entertainment became a study in how archetypal fears could be translated across different artistic mediums while maintaining their essential power to disturb and fascinate audiences who recognized in his story reflections of their own deepest anxieties about trauma, authority, and the corruption of knowledge. The animated interpretations of Scarecrow that emerged through various television series represented some of the most psychologically sophisticated portrayals of the character, as the constraints of broadcast standards for younger audiences forced creators to explore the intellectual and emotional dimensions of his villainy, rather than relying solely on graphic depictions of violence or explicit horror imagery. The Batman animated series version of Jonathan Crane established many of the visual and thematic elements that would influence subsequent adaptations, presenting him as a gaunt figure whose academic background and scientific methodology made his crimes feel more cerebral and disturbing than simple acts of violence or terrorism. The voice acting and character design choices that defined these animated portrayals created a version of Scarecrow that emphasized his psychological complexity while making his fear-based attacks accessible to audiences who might not be prepared for more graphic or realistic depictions of psychological torture and chemical warfare. The animated medium allowed for creative visualization of fear toxin effects that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive to achieve through live-action techniques, creating surreal sequences that translated the subjective experience of terror into visual metaphors that enhanced understanding of the character's methodology, while also providing genuine moments of psychological horror. The educational value of these animated adaptations extended beyond simple entertainment to encompass lessons about psychology, trauma, and the importance of confronting rather than avoiding one's deepest fears, as episodes featuring Scarecrow often concluded with insights about courage and resilience that helped younger viewers develop frameworks for understanding and managing their own anxiety responses. The portrayal of Batman's encounters with fear toxin provided particularly valuable examples of how even the strongest individuals could be vulnerable to psychological attack, while also demonstrating techniques for overcoming artificially induced terror through rational analysis and emotional support. The live-action film interpretations of Scarecrow, most notably in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, represented a significant departure from comic book and animated portrayals by grounding the character's methodology in realistic psychology and pharmacology that made his crimes feel genuinely plausible rather than fantastical, creating a version of Jonathan Crane whose fear toxin experiments seemed like logical extensions of legitimate psychiatric research rather than impossible comic book science. This realistic approach required extensive research into actual psychological conditions and pharmaceutical effects, resulting in portrayals that educated audiences about genuine mental health issues while also providing entertainment value. The casting and performance choices that brought Scarecrow to life in these film adaptations required actors who could convey both intellectual sophistication and psychological instability, creating characters whose academic credentials and professional demeanor made their criminal activities more disturbing through the contrast between their respectable facades and their twisted methodologies. The portrayal of Jonathan Crane as a corrupt psychiatrist working within Arkham Asylum provided opportunities to explore institutional failures and professional ethics that resonated with contemporary concerns about healthcare and one vest, authority figures who abused their positions of trust. The visual design and special effects techniques used to portray fear toxin hallucinations in live-action films pushed the boundaries of cinematic horror, while also requiring creators to develop new approaches to depicting subjective, psychological experiences that would be comprehensible to audiences without becoming gratuitously disturbing or traumatic. The resulting sequences often became highlights of their respective films, combining practical effects with digital enhancement to create experiences that genuinely unsettled viewers while also advancing the narrative and character development objectives of the broader stories. The video game adaptations of Scarecrow represented perhaps the most immersive and psychologically intense interpretations of the character, as interactive media allowed players to experience fear toxin effects from Batman's perspective, while also providing opportunities to explore Jonathan Crane's methodology and motivation through environmental storytelling and character development that extended far beyond what could be achieved through passive viewing experiences. The Arkham series of games, in particular, created versions of Scarecrow that combined elements from various previous adaptations, while also introducing innovations that took advantage of the unique capabilities of interactive entertainment. The level design and gameplay mechanics that accompanied Scarecrow encounters in video games required developers to translate psychological horror concepts into interactive challenges that would be engaging rather than simply frustrating, creating sequences that tested players' problem-solving abilities, while also providing genuine moments of tension and fear that enhanced the narrative impact of the character's presence. The use of audio design, visual distortion, and environmental manipulation in these interactive sequences often exceeded the psychological impact of film or television portrayals by making players active participants in the fear experience rather than passive observers. The voice acting and character modeling technologies that brought Scarecrow to life in video games allowed for more detailed and nuanced portrayals than had been possible in earlier media, creating versions of Jonathan Crane that could express subtle psychological complexity while also maintaining the theatrical presence necessary for effective video game antagonists. The interactive nature of the medium also provided opportunities for extended character development and backstory exploration that helped players understand the psychological origins of his criminal behavior, while also maintaining sympathy for the trauma that had shaped his development. The merchandising and collectible markets that developed around Scarecrow reflected the character's popularity across different demographic groups, while also demonstrating how fear-based imagery could be transformed into commercial products that appealed to consumers seeking to own representations of psychological concepts that fascinated and disturbed them. The action figures, statues, and other collectibles that featured Scarecrow required careful balance between accurate character representation and appropriate content standards for different age groups and market segments. The academic and critical analysis that Scarecrow's various media appearances generated revealed the character's significance as a cultural symbol that represented anxieties about education, authority, and the potential corruption of scientific knowledge that resonated across different social and political contexts. Scholarly discussions of the character often focused on his role as a representation of how trauma could transform intellectual gifts into instruments of destruction, while also exploring the ways that different adaptations reflected changing social attitudes toward mental health, institutional authority, and the relationship between knowledge and power. The international variations in Scarecrow portrayals across different cultural markets revealed how universal fears about psychological manipulation and institutional corruption could be expressed through culturally specific imagery, narrative frameworks that made the character relevant to diverse audiences while maintaining his essential psychological impact. The translations and adaptations necessary for different linguistic and cultural contexts often required significant modifications to dialogue and visual elements, while preserving the core psychological concepts that made the character effective as a representation of weaponized fear. The influence that Scarecrow's various media portrayals had on real-world discussions of psychology and mental health represented one of the most significant aspects of his cultural legacy, as his fictional use of fear toxin and psychological manipulation techniques sparked genuine educational conversations about anxiety disorders, trauma responses, and the ethical boundaries that should govern psychiatric research and treatment. The realistic elements incorporated into various adaptations often served as entry points for audiences to learn about legitimate psychological concepts, while also developing better understanding of mental health issues that affected themselves or people they knew. The evolution of special effects and production techniques across different media interpretations of Scarecrow demonstrated how advancing technology could enhance the psychological impact of fear-based storytelling, while also creating new opportunities for exploring the subjective experience of terror in ways that had never been possible through previous artistic mediums. The progression from simple costume design and makeup effects through sophisticated digital environments and virtual reality experiences showed how each technological advancement opened new possibilities for making audiences feel genuine. Psychological involvement in the characters, methodology, the crossover appearances and team-up scenarios that featured Scarecrow alongside other fictional villains provided opportunities to explore how his psychological expertise could complement or conflict with different criminal methodologies, creating storylines that examined the relationship between fear-based manipulation and other forms of villainy, while also testing the limits of his effectiveness against various types of heroic opposition. These collaborative narratives often revealed aspects of the character that could not be explored through solo appearances, while also advancing broader discussions about the nature of evil and the different forms that criminal behavior could take. The fan communities and creative cultures that developed around Scarecrow's various media appearances demonstrated the character's capacity to inspire creative expression and psychological exploration among audiences who found in his story elements that resonated with their own experiences of fear, trauma, and institutional authority. The fan fiction, artwork, and analytical discussions that emerged from these communities often provided insights into the character's psychological appeal that exceeded what professional critics and scholars had identified, revealing aspects of his cultural significance that could only be understood through close examination of audience responses. The therapeutic and educational applications that emerged from Scarecrow's media portrayals included their use in psychology courses and therapy sessions as examples of how fictional narratives could facilitate discussions of difficult topics related to trauma, anxiety, and the abuse of authority, demonstrating that even characters designed primarily for entertainment could serve valuable educational purposes when employed thoughtfully by qualified professionals. The realistic psychological elements incorporated into various adaptations made them useful tools for helping students and patients understand complex mental health concepts through concrete examples that were more engaging than purely theoretical discussions. The technological innovations that different media adaptations of Scarecrow inspired or incorporated reflected the character's role as a representation of how scientific knowledge could be perverted for harmful purposes, leading to portrayals that often featured cutting-edge research into neuroscience, pharmacology, and psychology that provided audiences with glimpses of genuine scientific frontiers, while also raising questions about the ethical implications of such research. The speculative technologies depicted in various Scarecrow stories often proved remarkably prescient, anticipating real-world developments in fields related to psychological manipulation and chemical intervention in mental processes. The social commentary that various Scarecrow adaptations provided about contemporary issues related to mental health care, institutional corruption, and the abuse of scientific authority reflected the character's continued relevance as a vehicle for exploring societal concerns that transcended simple entertainment value. The institutional settings that often featured prominently in Scarecrow stories provided opportunities to examine problems with healthcare systems, academic institutions, and research organizations that affected real audiences, while also advancing narrative objectives related to the character's personal history and criminal methodology. The legacy of these various media interpretations established Scarecrow as one of the most psychologically complex and culturally significant villains in popular entertainment, a character whose evolution across different artistic mediums had created a comprehensive exploration of fear, psychology, and institutional corruption that provided both entertainment value and educational insights for audiences seeking to understand the darker aspects of human nature and social organization. The cumulative effect of these diverse portrayals was to create a cultural symbol that transcended any single interpretation while maintaining consistent themes and psychological insights that made the character genuinely meaningful rather than merely frightening. The philosophical dimensions that emerged from careful analysis of Jonathan Crane's transformation into Scarecrow reveal profound truths about the nature of fear itself and its fundamental role in shaping human consciousness, social organization, and the eternal struggle between those who would create meaning through compassion and understanding versus those who seek power through the systematic exploitation of psychological vulnerability and emotional pain. His story transcends simple criminal biography to become an exploration of how knowledge divorced from wisdom can become a weapon against the very people it should serve, while also illuminating the complex relationship between trauma and genius that has produced some of history's most dangerous and influential figures. The psychological mirror that Scarecrow represents in Batman's Rogues Gallery reflects not merely the Dark Knight's personal fears and vulnerabilities, but also the broader questions about how individuals respond to childhood trauma and whether such experiences inevitably lead toward darkness or can be transformed into sources of strength and compassion that benefit others rather than destroying them. The parallel development of Bruce Wayne and Jonathan Crane from traumatized children into adults whose lives were defined by their responses to fear demonstrates how similar origins can produce radically different outcomes depending upon the choices made during crucial moments of moral and psychological development. The institutional critique embedded within Scarecrow's origin story extends far beyond simple condemnation of academic politics or psychiatric malpractice to encompass fundamental questions about how knowledge is acquired, validated, and applied within systems that claim to serve human welfare, while often perpetuating the very problems they purport to solve. Jonathan's transformation from promising student to criminal mastermind reveals how institutional failures in recognizing and addressing psychological damage can create monsters whose expertise exceeds that of the systems designed to contain them, while also demonstrating the seductive appeal of shortcuts to power that bypass moral development and ethical constraint. The educational implications of Scarecrow's methodology force uncomfortable recognition that the same techniques used to terrorize and control can also be employed to teach and enlighten, raising questions about the relationship between motivation and effect that challenge simple distinctions between beneficial and harmful applications of psychological knowledge. His success in inducing specific fear responses and modifying behavior through chemical intervention represents genuine advances in understanding human consciousness. Yet these achievements were purchased through suffering and employed for purposes that violated every principle of ethical research and therapeutic practice. The trauma psychology that underlies Jonathan's criminal career provides insights into how childhood abuse can shape adult behavior in ways that transcend simple cause and effect relationships to encompass complex interactions between genetic predisposition, environmental factors, and individual choice that determine whether damaged individuals become predators or protectors. Mary Keeney's systematic torture of her great-grandson created conditions that could have produced either a compassionate healer dedicated to preventing similar suffering or a calculating predator who inflicted equivalent pain upon others, demonstrating that trauma alone cannot explain or excuse the choices that define moral character. The scientific methodology that Scarecrow brings to his criminal activities reveals how academic training and research skills can be perverted to serve destructive purposes while maintaining the appearance of legitimate inquiry, creating forms of evil that are more dangerous than simple violence because they combine intellectual sophistication with moral corruption in ways that make them difficult to recognize and counter. His systematic approach to fear induction represents a genuine contribution to psychological knowledge, yet this contribution was achieved through methods that violated every ethical standard governing human research, while serving objectives that benefited only his own psychological needs rather than advancing human welfare. The social commentary embedded within Scarecrow's various portrayals across different media reflects contemporary anxieties about the relationship between expertise and authority, particularly concerns about how professional credentials and institutional positions can be used to mask harmful intentions, while providing access to vulnerable populations who trust in the legitimacy of established systems. Jonathan's ability to maintain his position as a respected professor while conducting illegal human experimentation demonstrates how institutional oversight can fail when confronted with individuals whose intelligence and professional reputation provide cover for activities that would be immediately recognized as criminal. if attempted by less credentialed perpetrators. The philosophical framework that governs Scarecrow's worldview represents a coherent but fundamentally flawed understanding of human nature that portrays fear as the primary motivating force behind all behavior, while dismissing concepts like love, compassion, and moral duty as mere illusions that conceal the brutal reality of psychological manipulation and power dynamics. This reductionist approach to human psychology allows him to achieve remarkable success in predicting and controlling behavior, yet it also blinds him to possibilities for redemption and growth that could transform his expertise from a weapon into a tool for healing and human development. The therapeutic potential that exists within Scarecrow's methodology, despite its criminal applications, suggests that his techniques could be modified and ethically applied to help individuals overcome genuine phobias and anxiety disorders, if separated from their current context of exploitation and harm. The precision with which he can induce and manipulate fear responses indicates deep understanding of psychological mechanisms that could potentially be used to develop more effective treatments for trauma-related conditions, though such applications would require fundamental changes in motivation and ethical framework that seem incompatible with his current psychological makeup. The relationship between knowledge and power that defines Scarecrow's criminal career illuminates broader questions about how societies should regulate and control access to information that could be used for harmful purposes while still allowing for legitimate research and educational advancement that requires engagement with potentially dangerous concepts and techniques. His ability to acquire and apply psychological knowledge without appropriate ethical oversight demonstrates the inadequacy of current systems for preventing the misuse of academic expertise, while also highlighting the difficulty of imposing external controls on individuals whose intelligence exceeds that of their potential supervisors. The cultural significance of Scarecrow as a symbol of weaponized fear extends beyond his role in fictional narratives to encompass real-world concerns about how terror can be employed by individuals and organizations to achieve political and social objectives through the systematic exploitation of psychological vulnerability and emotional manipulation. His methods provide a framework for understanding how authoritarian systems maintain control through the cultivation of anxiety and uncertainty rather than direct violence, while also demonstrating how expertise in fear psychology can be used to resist such manipulation by those who understand its mechanisms. The developmental psychology revealed through Jonathan's transformation from abused child to criminal mastermind provides insights into how early experiences shape adult personality in ways that can either limit or expand human potential, depending upon the availability of appropriate support and intervention during crucial periods of psychological formation. The absence of positive role models and therapeutic resources during his youth created conditions that channeled his considerable intellectual gifts toward destructive rather than constructive purposes, suggesting that different environmental factors might have produced radically different outcomes despite the severity of his early trauma. The moral complexity that characterizes Scarecrow's criminal activities challenges simple distinctions between good and evil by presenting a character whose actions serve legitimate intellectual curiosity and genuine desire for understanding, while also causing immense suffering and social harm through methods that violate fundamental principles of human dignity and ethical behavior. This complexity forces recognition that evil often emerges not from pure malice, but from the corruption of positive impulses by psychological damage and moral blindness that prevent individuals from recognizing the full implications of their choices and actions. The institutional psychology that enables Scarecrow's continued operations reveals how organizations can become complicit in harmful activities through bureaucratic inertia, professional territoriality, and failure to maintain adequate oversight of individuals whose expertise and reputation provide them with autonomy that can be abused if not properly monitored. Arkham Asylum's repeated failure to contain him demonstrates how institutional pride and resource limitations can prevent acknowledgement of systemic problems that require fundamental changes in approach and methodology rather than incremental improvements in existing procedures. The research ethics that Jonathan's career violates provide concrete examples of why professional standards and oversight mechanisms exist, while also demonstrating how such protections can be circumvented by individuals whose psychological sophistication allows them to manipulate systems designed to prevent exactly the kinds of abuses they wish to perpetrate. His ability to conduct illegal human experimentation while maintaining the appearance of legitimate research highlights the importance of external review and accountability measures that cannot be influenced by the personal charm or professional reputation of researchers seeking to avoid scrutiny. The psychological warfare techniques that Scarecrow employs against Batman and other opponents represent innovations in fear-based manipulation that have applications far beyond criminal activity, providing insights into how terror can be used as a tool for social control, while also demonstrating methods for recognizing and resisting such manipulation when encountered in political, commercial, or interpersonal contexts. The precision with which he can exploit individual psychological vulnerabilities offers lessons about personal security and emotional resilience that are valuable for anyone seeking to protect themselves against manipulation by others who might seek to use fear as a weapon. The redemptive potential that exists within Scarecrow's character, despite his criminal activities and moral corruption, suggests that even the most damaged individuals retain capacity for growth and change if provided with appropriate support and motivation to confront the psychological wounds that drive their destructive behavior. Jonathan's obvious intelligence and genuine curiosity about human psychology could potentially be redirected toward beneficial purposes if he could be helped to understand how his own trauma has shaped his worldview and prevented him from recognizing the full humanity of his victims. The ultimate tragedy of Scarecrow's story lies not in his criminal actions or the suffering he has caused, but in the waste of extraordinary potential that his psychological damage represents, as his intellectual gifts and deep understanding of human nature could have made him one of history's great contributors to psychological healing and human development, if different choices had been made during crucial moments of his moral and professional development. The recognition of this lost potential adds dimensions of sadness and regret to what might otherwise be simple condemnation of his criminal behavior, while also providing hope that similar tragedies might be prevented through better systems for identifying and supporting individuals whose childhood experiences place them at risk for similar corruption of their natural talents and moral instincts. The lasting impact of Scarecrow's legacy extends beyond the immediate entertainment and educational value of his various fictional portrayals to encompass genuine contributions to public understanding of fear psychology, trauma responses, and the complex relationships between knowledge, power, and moral responsibility that shape individual development and social organization in ways that continue to influence how societies address issues related to mental health, institutional oversight, and the prevention of abuse by individuals in positions of authority and trust. And so concludes our journey through the shadowed halls of Jonathan Crane's twisted psyche, from abused child to master of fear, from respected academic to Gotham's most psychologically dangerous predator. In his tale we find not merely the story of a villain, but a cautionary chronicle of how trauma, when left unhealed, can metastasize into something that threatens not just the wounded soul, but all who cross its path. The Scarecrow reminds us that fear, while a natural and necessary emotion, becomes monstrous when weaponized against the innocent, when academic knowledge is perverted into instruments of suffering rather than understanding. Yet in facing such darkness, we also discover the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility that even our deepest terrors can be conquered through courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that light can triumph over shadow. Rest now, brave dreamer, knowing that in understanding fear's origins, we rob it of its power to control our dreams.